Well, we have a very special video on our hands today. As I've probably stated a couple of times in the past, I really like Donald Duck. He's one of my favorite fictional characters. But of course, while I do love Donald for things like relating to his character nowadays, a big reason as to why he stuck with me is because I was all about Donald Duck as a kid. I read the comics and watched the cartoons day in and day out. Even one of my earliest memories is going to our house's postbox to find my first weekly issue of Donald Duck. And eventually, I also got myself a Donald Duck video game, aka the topic of this video, Donald Duck Quack Attack. Or Going Crackers if you're American. And it's also one of the first video games I remember playing. Developed and published by Ubisoft in the year 2000, this game is a platformer starring Donald Duck saving his girlfriend Daisy from the evil sorcerer Murloc. And as you'd probably expect from most licensed games of that time, Quack Attack was released on every console on the market. And when I say every console, I mean every console. Yeah, they really went the whole 9 yards with this one. So in total, by May of 2002, this game had been released on 8 different platforms. And while a good few of them were just ports of the same game, due to the hardware limitations of some of the consoles included, there are 5 completely different games under the Quack Attack umbrella. And so, to celebrate the 21st anniversary of its initial release, I decided to finally check out all the versions of this childhood game of mine and see if there's anything worth celebrating. So to summarize, we're gonna be looking at 5 different games in this video, starting with the 2D games on the handhelds, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, and ending with the 3D versions, one on N64, Dreamcast and PC, one on PS1, and one on PS2 and Gamecube. As such, we have quite a lot of ground to cover, so let's get right to it. This is the Donald Duck Quack Attack Retrospective. The first game on the chopping block is the Game Boy Color version, titled Disney's Donald Duck Quack Attack, which I've shortened to just Disney's Donald Duck for convenience's sake. And this is actually the only version of the game I've had no prior experience with before starting production on this video. All I know is that it's a 2D platformer, and that's about it. I'm not kidding, I have no clue what this game has in store. I've never even seen any gameplay. However, considering handheld ports of console games usually end up being kind of bad, and that handheld being Game Boy Color of all things sounds like a recipe for disaster, I'm keeping my expectations fairly low. But who knows? Maybe I'll come out of this pleasantly surprised. One thing you should know is that all versions share basically the same story. Daisy gets kidnapped by Murloc, and Donald goes to save her with the help of Gyro's teleporter. However, the way it's presented in the 2D and 3D games respectively is a bit different, so let's get that out of the way real quick. So for some reason, Murloc announces publicly that he's kidnapped Daisy like he's Megamind or some shit, and Donald talks with Gyro on the phone about how to save her. Gyro mentions that they could use his teleporter to get Donald to Murloc's temple, but Murloc then steals the blueprints for Gyro's machine, leaving it incomplete. So it's up to Donald to go and hunt for the blueprints and search for a way to get to Murloc's temple to save Daisy. That's pretty much the whole story in a nutshell, and it's presented with these cool illustrations. They're a bit crunched due to being on the Game Boy Color, but it works for what it is. And I also like that the game has its own little twist at the end that the other versions don't have, where after his defeat, Murloc drags Donald with him to an alternate dimension for one final level. I'll talk about that in detail a bit later, but all in all, I think it's a cool add-on to the story. And now, let's get to the actual game on offer. As I said, the game is a 2D platformer, and your objective in each level is basically just to get to the end. The main collectibles are these tokens that grant an extra life when you collect 20 of them, and there are also health pickups, actual extra lives, and 2 kinds of golden tokens. One that turns you into Hyper Donald, an invincible state which you can use to break down different obstacles, and another one that only does so when you're at full health. The most substantial collectibles though are the blueprints, one hidden in each level. And shockingly enough, the game actually controls pretty well. The game is pretty damn responsive, and Donald moves at a nice speed that helps the game not feel like a slog. The descent time after a jump is a bit weirdly slow, but you get used to it after a while. However, it isn't all perfect. The camera, for one, is not that great. Most of the time it's fine, but especially when you're switching directions a lot, it gets really disorienting very quickly. Another prominent problem with regular gameplay are the enemy hitboxes. The only way to kill enemies is to jump on them, and sometimes, if your positioning isn't just right, you'll take damage instead of killing the enemy, despite clearly jumping on top of them. I'd say it's not a deal breaker overall, but it can happen a lot, and it's really annoying. Getting a bit more positive though, I actually really like the level design for the most part. The first two worlds, Ducky Mountain and Duckburg, are both pretty simple platforming levels overall, but they both have a lot of alternate paths leading to extra lives and blueprints. Ducky Mountain doesn't go that crazy, but Duckburg has tons to explore in each level, and some of the optional paths can really challenge your platforming skills. Magica Dispel's Mansion, on the other hand, takes a slightly different approach. Instead of complete linearity, each level is almost labyrinth-like, where you progress by finding these special tokens to make platforms appear or by breaking down doors and hatches with Hyper Donald. And while the main goal is still to get from point A to point B, I appreciate the amount of complexity put into the design even in spite of the game's linear nature. And the same goes for the final world, Murloc's Temple, though this time the focus is more on tricky platforming than finding your way forward by exploring each room. There are also these rocks, which are apparently made of rubber since they boost your jump height when you jump on them.
Yeah, I got nothing.
Unfortunately, the last two worlds also fall into cheap difficulty at times, especially Murloc's Temple. In Magica's Mansion, there are some really weird and tricky jumps you need to do, and it feels like the only way you'll get past them is with trial and error or just sheer luck. Murloc's Temple takes it up to 11 though, and when I say the platforming is tricky, oh boy. Corridors filled with enemies with either bullshit hitboxes or long-range attacks that they continue to use even when they're out of view, precarious hazard placement where avoiding damage is nigh impossible, and way too many leaps of faith for my liking. And combined with the game's pretty inconsistent checkpoint placement, it starts to wear on you after a while, and I was just glad to be done with each level. While there is solid design here, those bullshit moments just sour it for me. Speaking of things I don't like about this game, let's talk about the bosses. The first boss is a bear, but you don't even really fight it. All you have to do is jump on these beehives to feed it honey, and apparently it's filled with tranquilizers because it makes the bear pass out. This one isn't terribly hard or anything, but these bees are really annoying because of the hitbox problem. As for the second fight with the Beagle Boys, it's over in less than 30 seconds. I like that you can actually attack the boss this time, but come on guys, that was pathetic. Surprisingly though, I actually kinda like the Magica fight. Her attacks are annoying to dodge due to the lack of space, but smacking her with a chandelier is pretty satisfying, and each part of the fight has its own checkpoints, so it's not too bad. Not an amazing fight, but it's alright. But the final fight with Murloc might just be the worst fucking thing in this entire game. The fight begins with him turning into a bat that has, you guessed it, a bullshit hitbox, and you fight him on a moving platform above lava, which means you need to time your jumps extremely well or you're going straight into the lava or anything that isn't Murloc's weak point, wherever the hell that is. But the second part is even worse because you need to wait for these lava platforms to cool down before you can get to Murloc himself, but the platforms drop lava on your head that you need to avoid, and I swear to God it's impossible to do without taking damage. I can't tell you how many fucking times I died on the same goddamn lava drop simply because I just didn't have enough room to dodge it. And if you do make it onto the platforms, of course Murloc starts shooting at you because I guess this game just has been too easy by this point. Just holy shit, fuck this boss. On the other hand though, I actually really like this game's chase levels, as they're much more varied than just run from the big scary thing. First of all, the ones in Ducky Mountain and Magica's Mansion actually have you as the chaser. They are auto-scrollers, which kinda sucks, but they also have this nice and quick pace that I like a lot, and I just like the deviation. Also, for some reason, this ghost here kinda looks like Scrooge McDuck. What did they mean by this? But my favorite chase level is Duckburgs, as the gimmick here is that the helicopter chasing you mimics your movements, and the key to beating the level is to manipulate the helicopter by delaying your jumps or taking the same paths multiple times. It really tests the player's skill with their control of Donald, and I love the original twist it has. The final chase level is probably my least favorite though, as it's fairly straightforward compared to the other ones, but even then it has a cool twist of it only turning into a chase level halfway through. Now, let's talk about the final bonus level. Remember those blueprints I mentioned earlier? Well, the only way to access this level is to collect all of them, which makes them pretty important. And the level's pretty good. It combines gimmicks from the previous levels while also adding a few of its own, and while some of the cheap difficulty is still present, it doesn't get nearly as overwhelming thanks to it just being a single level. It's just a nice final hurrah to test you, and I really like that. I could criticize the game lacking the true ending behind collecting the blueprints, but since they're pretty easy to find by simply exploring, I don't really mind it for the most part. As for how the game looks and sounds, it's alright. I didn't really have the highest expectations for this, but the sprite work is pretty solid and each character is recognizable. Environments are also great, and while some levels do have a pretty overwhelming use of one color in particular, it's solid overall. I especially like how Murloc's temple combines a jungle aesthetic with the temple not really seen in the 3D versions. And the game also runs at a pretty stable 60 FPS. In emulation at least. As for the soundtrack, well, first of all, it's not very big, as each main level used the same track for most of its stages, but it's pretty good all things considered. Some of the tracks can get a little grating after a while, though it might be more because of the Game Boy Color sound font than anything, but each level theme does fit the mood they're going for, and the chase level themes in particular I would even dare to put somewhere in the banger territory. And that's pretty much all for Disney's Donald Duck on Game Boy Color. I gotta say, I'm pretty positively surprised. Granted, the game definitely has its problems, as I've listed, but overall I had a pretty fun time with this one. With some more polish and possibly more collectibles to go after in the levels, this genuinely could have been a hidden gem of sorts. As it stands, it's just kinda alright, but with how low my expectations were on the outset, I will most definitely take what I can get. Next up, it's time to advance a generation forward with Donald Duck Advance for, well, the Game Boy Advance. This is actually the last released version of Quack Attack, so does that make it a demake of the console versions or a remake of the Game Boy Color games since they're similar gameplay and presentation wise? Why did you have to make this so confusing, Ubisoft? Anyway, as for my history with the game, there's not a whole lot, but I've actually played a bit of this in the past. However, from what little I played, I remember not really liking it all that much. But with the Game Boy Color game turning out to be surprisingly good, and again, this game being very similar to it gameplay-wise, maybe this could be the more polished version of it that I was hoping for. I'm still keeping my expectations fairly low, but I'll hold out a bit of hope at least. Since the story is pretty much the same as the Game Boy Color version, we can jump straight into the gameplay. Advance is also a linear 2D platformer, but it makes some changes to the formula. Each level now has 3 energy spheres to collect, which are mandatory to exit the level you're in. And I know I didn't complain about mandatory collectibles with the GBC version, but I gotta draw the line somewhere. While the blueprints were crucial to getting the true ending, you can still beat the game without them, and they were, for the most part, pretty fun and easy to collect. In Advance, getting the energy spheres feels like a chore. They aren't incredibly out of your way, and you do keep any you collect after you die, but my problem is how they're collected in the first place. You see, each sphere has to be activated first by this book thing, and you only have a set amount of time to reach the sphere before it deactivates. The time limit is pretty generous in the first few levels, but as the game goes on, they get more and more ridiculous compared to the distance you need to travel. It's never impossible to get all the spheres, so it's not like the game becomes unplayable because of them, but they're a major annoyance that I could do without. Another noticeable change is that there's only one boss in the whole game, that being the fight against Murloc. Now, the bosses in the GBC version were garbage, so this could be a blessing, but I still can't help but feel weird with how the game just progresses from one world to the next with no fanfare. That and the Murloc fight is actually pretty good. It's not amazing by any means, but it's a pretty solid and challenging fight. And if the rest of the bosses could have been this solid, it just makes me more disappointed by the lack of them. Anyways, going back to the main gameplay, there are some choice words I want to say on that as well. Most of the basic controls are the same as the GBC version, but there's one thing that makes the game feel so much worse: Donald's default moving speed. It's so abysmally slow, and the game's pace suffers tremendously because of that. The game does try to alleviate this with the addition of a sprint button, but that has its own set of problems. Because the run works by toggling it rather than holding it down for the distance you want to run, and that Donald has a pretty lengthy stopping animation, using the sprint regularly feels really clunky and imprecise. There are parts of the levels that have been built with the run in mind, but because it's so clunky everywhere else, you're mostly stuck with the slow-ass walking speed. The levels themselves are mostly pretty solid, and I like that they added checkpoint markers for clarity's sake, but there are a few things that make the experience weaker for me. Unlike the GBC version, which rewarded exploration with extra lives and such, this game has way less of that. A majority of the collectibles can be found just as you go, and there are very few extra places to find off the beaten path, which is a big shame. And the game also catches into the same pitfalls as its predecessor. That's right, the camera still sucks, and the hitboxes are terrible. I did notice this time that the hitbox is usually located somewhere around the enemy's head, which helps, I guess, but it's not entirely foolproof, especially with smaller enemies. And just like last time, the later levels fall pretty hard into the bullshit territory. Well, now that we've talked at length about things I don't like about this game, let's get into some positives. And just like the GBC version, I really like the chase levels. They're not as interesting this time as you're just running from things in each one, but this is where the sprint really gets to shine. Because the levels are designed for you to go as fast as possible, you can basically just let loose and keep running almost the entire time. And not gonna lie, even though it turns the game into a pseudo auto runner, getting the timing right on some of this platforming feels super satisfying. These are easily the best part of the entire game and a far cry from the slow pace of the normal levels. Lastly, on the gameplay front, and I have to start complaining again, let's talk about the 100% completion. Instead of using the tokens, Advance uses the stars from the other versions as its main collectible, and in order to get 100%, you need to collect every single one from each level. Now this wouldn't be such a problem if the enemies also didn't drop them and they didn't slowly float away after you defeat said enemies. And the worst part is that even though enemies do respawn, the stars they drop do not. So if you miss even one star dropped by an enemy, you need to start the whole level over. And if you defeat an enemy near a wall, the stars will go inside, making it impossible to even get them. Truly the peak of game design right here. Because of this, Advance ended up being the only version I didn't 100% because the progress is just way too tedious and all you get from it is this picture of Daisy. However, on the presentation side of things, I don't really have many problems. The game uses the same soundtrack as the PS2/GameCube version, so I won't talk about it here, but the visuals are rock solid and definitely a step up from the Game Boy Color game. The cutscene portraits look way cleaner and the levels are much more colorful and just less washed out overall. There's still some big color overuse in some instances, but it's a big glow up when compared to its predecessor. And I think that's all I really wanted to say here. In case it wasn't obvious, I'm not a huge fan of Donald Duck Advance. It's definitely not awful, but it feels like such a step down from the Game Boy Color version. The pace of the game slows down to a crawl thanks to the awful move speed and the sprint being clunky as hell, and with the level exploration no longer being a big part of the design, honestly makes the game pretty boring when all's said and done. Like I said before, there are definitely parts of this game I enjoy, but those bigger issues combined with the small annoyances like the energy spheres and the faults the game shares with the GBC version just water the game down to a mediocre mess. And after being positively surprised by its predecessor, that's a really big letdown. And now we arrive at the version. The version I grew up with and also grew very attached to. Like seriously, I can't get it off me. As longtime viewers probably know, this is the version I've talked about in the past and declared to be one of my all-time favorite games. I'd say I know this game inside out, but it has been a while since I gave it a proper playthrough, so no time like the present. For this segment, I played the Dreamcast version of the game. I was originally going to play through the N64 version to cover all my bases since it has some presentation differences, but the Dreamcast version runs better, so I decided to go with that instead. I'll be covering the N64 version's quirks as we go along, but for now, let's see if this childhood favorite of mine holds up at all. Alright, let's cover the story real quick before anything else. The setup is still the same. Daisy gets kidnapped and Donald goes to save her, but this time Gladstone Gander is also involved, and the two along with Gyro are preparing to watch a TV report by Daisy on Murloc's temple. Not sure why she thought going there was a good idea when it's apparently common knowledge that Murloc is an evil sorcerer, but I guess you just gotta get clout somehow. So Daisy gets taken in the middle of the broadcast, and both Donald and Gladstone are eager to save her. With Gyro's teleporter, they could reach Murloc's temple easily, but first they need to install these antennas in different locations to strengthen the machine's power and reach. But Gladstone is an impatient motherfucker and leaves before he can hear this, so it's basically just up to Donald. I love these early 2000s CG cutscenes. There's only two of them, one in the beginning and one at the end, but they have a ton of charm and all the characters look great. Also, speaking of the end cutscene, it turns out that the machine Murloc was working on in the beginning was a dispenser for chocolate popcorn. Evil really is petty if he kidnapped Daisy just so he wouldn't have to share this machine's existence with the rest of the world. On that note, one big difference that the N64 version has is the lack of these very cutscenes. Instead, they're made with the in-game engine, like the boss cutscenes in the Dreamcast version. Obviously, I like the CG cutscenes more since these are a bit jank, but they still have their own charm. Now for the gameplay department, all the console versions are 3D platformers, and just like the handheld versions, the games are divided into 4 worlds, with this time each having 4 linear platforming levels, a chase level, and a boss fight. And if this gameplay style reminds you in any way of certain PS1 animal mascot platformer series, don't worry about it. And right off the bat, can I just gush how great this game feels? If you play this coming off of any other 3D platformer, you're probably not gonna think too much about it, but especially after going through Advanced, this feels like heaven. Donald's weight is just right, there are no bullshit hitboxes to speak of, and the control is overall smooth as butter. The only complaint I could have is that the 3D movement isn't flawless, but I'd be really splitting hairs if I let that bother me too much. The levels themselves don't do anything super crazy with their design, but in my opinion at least, they're still very enjoyable. And I think the game is a lot better at differentiating every level in each world. While they still recycle a lot, the stages still have their own challenges and aesthetics. This is particularly apparent in Duckburg, where each stage has its own distinct time of day or setting, which is a big reason why it's my favorite world in the game. As for the main gameplay, I already talked about how the game feels much better than the 2D games, but I'd like to touch on something I didn't really talk about previously, the health system. All versions share the same principles. The normal full health state is called Happy Donald, but when you take a hit, you enter a state of invincibility and become Angry Donald, and you die if you take one more hit. The specifics are handled a little differently in each version, but the 3D versions handle it the best in my opinion, mainly because it's a great representation of Donald's temperament. Taking a hit turns you into Berserk Donald, represented by this cloud of smoke, and as little as it is, I think these moods are a cool extra detail that fit Donald's character like a glove. For collectibles, the big thing are the nephew's toys, which work a bit like the energy spheres from Advance, where you hit the Murloc book and then dash to the toy before it turns back into a ghost toy. But unlike the energy spheres, these are not required to exit the levels. What a concept! You do need to collect these boss gate pieces to progress, but there's only one in each level, and most importantly, you don't need to activate anything to collect them. Also, Donald does a little dance whenever he collects one of these, and Yeah, same. Collecting all the toys in every level gives you access to that world's chase level, which are all pretty much the same and don't try to do anything as cool as the GBC game, for example, but I still enjoy them a lot. Completing them will allow you to take part in Gladstone's time trials, which are exactly what they say on the tin. Just complete each normal level as fast as you can, and no, you still don't have to worry about any similarities to any PS1 games. Your prize for these time trials are additional costumes that you can switch on at any time in Gyro's lab, and I love all of them. Tourist, Magician, Indiana fucking Jones, let's go! And while some of the later ones can get a little tricky, they're pretty easy overall and not much of a headache. And I like that it's a race against the clock with the clock counting down rather than taking your time. And that brings me to a common criticism with this version in particular, that the game is way too easy. There are some parts that can be a bit challenging on your first time through, but especially if you're experienced with 3D platformers like this, the game is a breeze. And I won't deny any of that. The game was clearly made with children in mind, and as such, the challenges are fairly simple. However, I think that works to this game's benefit. The way I see it, the game being easy and short means it doesn't waste the player's time and gives them a chance to just knock it out for a fun afternoon or something. This simplicity also allowed the developers to make the game as Donald Duck as possible, which shows in the different aspects of the presentation and Donald's playstyle. Maybe it's nostalgia talking here, but I think the charm this version has is still undeniable. And if nothing else, the main gameplay is still, you know, fun! Speaking of fun things, let's talk about the boss fights. Now, these are generally pretty simple and easy, but they're still very enjoyable, and again, after the shitfest in the Game Boy Color game, I'm so glad I can actually enjoy these. The only one I kinda don't like is the third fight with Magica, but it's mostly fine. The only annoying part are these stupid pumpkins. And even though it's not anything mind-blowing, the final boss is quite a spectacle, with you running away from Murloc's different dragon forms and finally shooting him down with a turret. The presentation is also really solid all around. The game has a similar aesthetic to Rayman 2, since I think it runs on the same engine, and it gives the game a nice clean polygonal look. It might look outdated by today's standards, but considering how colorful the game is and how the characters are anthropomorphic animals, I think it's held up really well. The game has voice acting as well, and they got most, if not all, of the actors to play each role. Tony Anselmo as Donald, Tress MacNeil as Daisy, Russi Taylor as Huey, Dewey, and Louie, etc. And while there's not a ton of voice acting due to the lack of cutscenes, what there is really solid. And more importantly, Donald does all the appropriate noises you can think of when going through the levels. And finally, the soundtrack. Admittedly, I've never really thought much of the music aside from a couple of iconic tunes, which led me to believe that the OST wasn't anything all that special. But after this most recent playthrough, I've come to realize that this soundtrack is awesome. The soundtrack for this version was composed by Daniel Masson, and damn did he ever do a good job. Each world's level themes go for a certain vibe with their instrumentation, which I think it nails perfectly, and they can also be surprisingly catchy. Not every theme is an absolute banger, but even the weakest tracks in the game are at least pleasant to listen to, and that, if anything, should speak volumes of how good this soundtrack is. It is a bit weaker in the N64 version due to the poorer sound quality of the console in general, but it's still alright. And I think that's pretty much everything of note with this version. If I didn't make it increasingly obvious in this segment, I still love this game. While it's a very quick experience, it's so much fun to play even with its simplicity. It's got loads of charm, and as a fan of the character, this game has stayed with me from the early days of my childhood. And I still think it holds up perfectly, even if it isn't quite near the top of my favorite games as it used to be. But it's still in the top 10, so if you can play only one game from this video, be it for monetary reasons or just lack of interest, please make it this one. Like I said, it won't waste your time and it's filled to the brim with charm, so if you get the chance, please. Here we have a bit of an anomaly. I was originally going to cover the PS1 version in the previous segment, but it turns out there's a lot more differentiating it than I originally thought. What makes this version an anomaly, however, is that a good few of the levels are exactly the same as those in the Dreamcast N64 PC version, but just as many are completely original. And because of that, I end up having a lot more to say about this one, hence why it now has its own segment. But since the previous segment already covered quite a lot of ground, this shouldn't take as long. As for if the things I have to say about this version are good or bad, let's find out. Since I already alluded to it, let's start by talking about the level design. The basic structure is pretty much the same as the Dreamcast version. You complete 4 levels, fight the boss, and unlock the chase level by collecting the toys. Like I said, some of the levels in the game are exactly the same as the Dreamcast version, most notably Ducky Mountain with all of its levels, but apart from that, while there are levels that borrow a lot from their counterparts, they're actually completely new for the most part. And I'd say a couple are even better than their counterparts, because the PS1 version introduced the mind-blowing concept of 2.5D to some of the levels. Again, the levels don't go super crazy, but they're more challenging, and some even have a few cool set pieces. One of the 2.5D levels, First Avenue, might just be my favorite individual stage across all versions, because it takes you all around the city's landscape, and it's really varied in its structure and aesthetic. It also takes you way closer to the building's roofs than the actual level called The Roofs. I also really like what they did with the chase levels. It's not a major change, but instead of the chase just stopping at each checkpoint, there's usually an interactable thing that stops the chaser temporarily, like these gates in Main Street or this hammer in Underhanded. And while small, it makes stopping the chaser somewhat more skill-based this time. And Main Street also starts with you as the chaser, so bonus points for that. However, the gameplay experience is far from flawless. This version is, for a lack of a better term, very jank, both in its visuals and the game feel. And it comes with its fair share of annoyances, such as problems with depth perception, weird collision hitboxes with certain platforms that don't feel natural, and a fair amount of input lag. The latter especially is annoying when you need to attack an enemy right after a jump. The game doesn't recognize your input in time, and you take damage. Also, I'm not that fond of the time trials in this version. I mean, they are harder, and you don't even get extra time from the boxes. But that's not really my problem, it's that some of the later levels are really not built for rushing. The time limit is still fairly generous, so with a cool head, you should be able to get them done without too much trouble, but it just makes these really unsatisfying. Speaking of the later levels, I think this version also falls into the similar pitfall of the 2D versions with "let's make these bullshit difficult," though thankfully nowhere near the same extent. The game is pretty generous with extra lives, and more than bullshit, I'd say most of these particular levels are just really annoying. Like these fireballs in Murky Way, hate these things. Let's talk a little bit about the bosses too. The 2 first ones are basically the same as Dreamcast's, but Magicka's and Murloc's fights are completely different. I think I actually like Magicka's fight more than the Dreamcast versions, but the final boss is definitely weaker. It's not a bad fight by any means, and I like that you get to hit Murloc directly this time, but some of the hazards are so annoying. Namely, these stupid arrows that blend into the background way too much. As for the presentation, I already mentioned the visuals and how jank they are, but I like them. They have that PS1 charm that a lot of the games from this era have. I'm gonna talk about the music more in the next segment because this version used the same soundtrack as that version and fans for some reason, but I just want to say that this game's audio is really glitchy. Now this could also be because of the copy I have, it's pre-owned and the disc has some smudges here and there, but yeah. Sometimes the game would just not play music at all, sometimes it would just stop playing all of a sudden, or most of the time when the game starts to play the level sounds at an incredibly high volume for no reason, drowning out everything else. But that's really all for the PS1 version. And honestly, even though it's definitely inferior to the Dreamcast N64 PC version, I'd still say it's worth a playthrough, especially if it's your only choice. It has its jank, as you've seen, but the good definitely outweighs the bad, and I'm glad I got to experience this version after all these years. So, some of you might remember when I said this.
So as much as I would like to tell you to never play a certain version of one of my favorite games,
I think that should cover my history with the PS2 GameCube version pretty well. Yes, believe it or not, despite me loving the crap out of the PC version of Quack Attack, I hated the 6th gen console version. I felt that it had none of the charm, none of the fun, none of the things that I loved about Quack Attack, to the point where at one time, it was my least favorite game, period. However, I've softened my stance during recent years, and I wanted to give the game another fair shot since I never actually got very far in it when I was younger. Hell, one of the reasons I didn't like this version was because it was more difficult than the version I grew up with, and that came off as a bit jarring. But since I'm obviously more intelligent and capable nowadays, let's see if my dislike of this game came from me simply being stupid and young, or if there was some actual point to it. The formula is still pretty much the same, though for some reason you have to go through the levels in a predetermined order this time. I guess the freedom of choice was just too much to handle, and compared to the other 3D versions, the level order is more akin to the 2D ones. But the side objectives are where this game's differences really show. The biggest feature this version has going for it are the special moves and the new bonus collectibles based around them. Firstly, to even get these moves, you need to collect a chain of gears in quick succession enough times throughout the level to form the word special here, I think. This method is a little weird to me honestly, but as long as it works, I guess. And once you complete a level with the whole word, the nephews award you with one of these special moves. They're all executed by jumping on 3 or more enemies in a row and then entering a button combination for the move you want within a time limit, and once successful, you get double the gears when collecting them. Unfortunately though, I have some very mixed feelings about these moves. On one hand, they're all pretty funny and they fit Donald's character, adding once again to the charm of the game. And in normal gameplay, I think they're fine, and I'll admit that getting a big chain going for some big gains can be pretty satisfying. But the problem comes with the bonus challenges you mainly use these moves for, where you need to go through each level again and use the appointed moves 2 or 3 times. And usually there are only a few specific spots in each level where you can take out enemies in a row feasibly, and sometimes even missing one means you fail. What really kills these challenges for me though is that you have to do them without dying. It's not like the game's even all that hard, but when you're making daring leaps to activate the moves, you're much more prone to making mistakes. Not to mention that you could be happily done with the challenge only to die right before the end, and it's back to the beginning for you, bitch! And unfortunately, this also extends to the time trials, as they took completely to the Crash Bandicoot, this game's original formula of dying sends you all the way back to the beginning. This wouldn't bother me that much, but like the PS1 version, some levels were not designed to be rushed, and the later ones are just so fucking long on top of that. And as a result, the game is really not fun to complete. That being said, there is some merit to doing the special move challenges at least, as they unlock a slew of bonus levels after beating them, and I do like these. But then you remember they also have time trials, and that they're the hardest levels in the game and also really long. Pain! I mean, you could just not do them, but if you've gone so far as to unlock these bonus levels in the first place, then you're probably doing the time trials as well, so yeah. As for how the game plays, the game feel is pretty good. It's a little slippery compared to the other 3D versions, but it's nothing unmanageable. The levels themselves are also pretty solid for the most part, but there's something this game does, or doesn't do, that makes this lineup the weakest of the 3D versions, and that would be differentiating each stage. The levels within the same world do use same elements across all versions, but here the levels blend in together so much. I could kind of forgive it in the GBC game because the game was focused more on making the levels more explorative than making each individual stage stand out, but when the levels in this game are pretty much just straight lines, it's harder to ignore. And while not as bad as Advance, like that game, it makes the game just kind of boring in the long run. An idea with the stages I like are the golden threads, which work as the new method for obtaining costumes. There are 2 or 3 hidden in each level, and I like the concept for potentially asking the player to explore to find them. However, the actual way to get them is to turn into Hyper Donald, which in this game only makes your attacks different, like with this supersonic quacking attack, and use it to break obstacles to the hidden areas. The problem is that they're usually just right there on the main path, and it's literally the same every single time. So it really does nothing for the levels except make them more annoying in some cases due to their location. Also not helping the level's case is that the chase levels are so uninteresting. It's literally just a giant hand chases you in a straight line, rinse and repeat 4 times with a different backdrop. I do like that there's sort of a story reason for why the hand chases you every time, but it just feels so soulless to just have the same thing chase you over and over and over. Another thing I don't like about the levels can be found right about here. Why is there an arbitrary timer in my Donald Duck platformer? I mean, the game definitely gives you more than enough time to complete each level, but why? All it does is add needless stress on the player, and there's no justification in the story or the mechanics for this. And it's not like anything interesting happens when the timer runs out, you just die. I feel like there are some dark implications here. Thankfully, the bosses are pretty neat. Again, the final boss is not as good as the Dreamcast version, and it might even be a little worse than PS1's, but all the other bosses are solid stuff. Bernadette is basically the same, she just has a snazzy helmet. I love that you actually get to fight all 3 Beagle Boys instead of just one, and smashing them with their own wrecking ball is satisfying, if a bit finicky. And I might actually like this version's Magica fight the most. It's challenging without being bullshit, and smacking her in the face with a skull is pretty cool. And now for the presentation. I do like how the game looks overall. The character models are great, and there's even a nude CG cutscene in the game. Too bad it's only the one to establish that Murloc is the one sending the hand after you, and I wish the game would have more of something like this to either flesh out Murloc's plot or why all the other villains are trying to kill me, but whatever. My real problem with the visual representation are some of the levels' looks. I already mentioned the sameness of the levels, but another thing I don't like are the new hub areas. In the other 3D versions, they were based on each world, but now they're just these tube rooms, and it feels lifeless. There are other small things that bother me too, and all of that combined drags the visuals down for me, even if overall the game looks pretty good. As for the soundtrack, it's finally time to talk about the elusive OST composed by Sean K. Clement. Like I said, this soundtrack is used for 3 different versions, and you might have noticed that I've been using tracks from Daniel Masson's soundtrack for a couple of these segments. The reason for that is simple: this soundtrack is way too small. The tracks only change between worlds, meaning that every platforming level in the same world uses the same track. And to make matters worse, the chase level themes and the boss themes are both basically just one track with very slight additions for each world. And it's not like this soundtrack is even bad, but after listening to the same 12 tracks for 3 games, it gets a little repetitive. I think I got out all my thoughts and feelings here. I'll be honest, even though I've been fairly negative throughout this segment, my feelings are pretty positive overall. It's probably because I went in with such low expectations, and I can definitely see why I might have not liked it very much as a kid, but it's a fairly solid and inoffensive hallway 3D platformer. It has quite a boatload of problems, yes, and I wouldn't blame you for saying it's pretty mediocre, mostly because it kinda is, but I was still way more motivated to see this through to the end than I was with Advance. The 100% completion still sucks a lot though, and if you're going to give this game a shot, stay far away from it. You're doing yourself a favor. Well, if that wasn't the longest video of my channel ever since I started making proper content, I don't know what is. So yeah, in the end, these games are pretty much the standard licensed game fare. There were definitely some surprises along the way, and I still love the Dreamcast N64 PC version to bits, but when all said and done, they're not all that special. It's obvious these games were made for kids, but there is actual effort if you look hard enough, and I definitely call them some of the better stuff on the licensed game market. If you're interested in these games, well, the Dreamcast version gets my highest recommendation, and I do encourage checking out the PS1 and Game Boy Color games as well, even with their faults. Though since these games are already over 20 years old, finding copies might be a bit problematic for more than a couple of reasons, so if you want to give these a try, do what you must. And if you're wondering how I'd rank each version, here's how I'd put it. I do think each one has something salvageable, and if you're a fan of Donald Duck like me, you'll probably get some mileage out of them. Or at least some of them.
I'm FinnishDuck, and now that the video's done, can I please get this duck beak off my face? Oh, thank God. What?
I wanna be a hero. Pokemon.